Welcome back to Real Talk with Susan Stone and Kristina Supler. We are full-time moms and attorneys bringing our student defense legal practice to life with real, candid conversations. Today's topic is quite serious: school safety.
This is a really difficult topic to discuss. It's a topic that evokes anxiety and fear, and it's top of mind for all of us, particularly as families and households are getting ready for children to go back to school. So we really thought it was essential to do an episode on school safety.
And every time there is another school shooting, it seems like there's a lot of finger pointing and blame placed, and it's not constructive to constantly place blame. So we really wanted to have a guest here to talk about what are steps we could take to be more solution focused.
With that in mind, let's kick it off with today's guest, Joe Hendry. We're here today to talk about school safety and best practices. We're so pleased to be joined by our guest, Joe Hendry. Joe served in the Marine Corps and then was a law enforcement officer for nearly 30 years. Now he's transitioned. He's in the private sector where he's Senior Director of On-Site Services for Navigate 360, which is basically a company that provides safety solutions for school.
We really are lucky to have you here, Joe. Can I just brag about you a little bit before we ask you questions? You were named by the Ohio Department of Homeland Security. I'm going to do it anyways, even if it embarrasses you, and the Ohio Attorney General's office as an expert in civilian and law enforcement responses to active threats. Mr. Hendry was also selected as one of only 18 subject matter experts in school security in the world by his peers at the, and correct me if I get this wrong, Joe, the ASIS International Organization. And we've really avoided this topic, Kristina, because fortunately school safety hasn't really hit our practice. We haven't really dealt with that issue in terms of our clients and our cases, but too much has happened, and we felt it was really important to bring you on, Joel, and thank you so much for agreeing to talk about school safety.
Thanks again for joining us. Through the pandemic, Susan and I, in our practice, have seen a surge in students with mental health issues, and now we turn on the news, and here we are. So let's start with the big question. Are schools safe today?
I think schools are relatively safe compared to a lot of other locations because there's so much in place from prior events since Columbine occurred. Schools have taken security for the most part fairly seriously. So a lot of things were in place potentially physically security-wise from incidents at Columbine and Virginia Tech and Sandy Hook that started requiring special locks, doors, fencing, things like that. But you are correct. There's been a huge uptick in mental health issues since the pandemic, and that affects security in ways that we haven't seen before, prepared for, actually.
Kristina and I deal with mental health issues that impact the types of accommodations that students need in school, such as ADHD or dyslexia or autism. We're talking about something very, very, very different. And I just want to know, in your experience working on these issues, is there a profile of the type of person or who would become an active shooter?
So the Secret Service has done two major studies since Columbine and has been really unable to come up with a definitive answer on there's a profile for an active shooter. We have a profile for someone who's a serial killer. There are indicators of a person who may become an active shooter, but having a set threat assessment profile of one, there isn't. There's overlap with things. Obviously, the most recent one, Uvalde, that individual really didn't have any run-ins, may have had some mental health issues that really didn't become very obvious through the education system. I've read that he was denied access to some educational benefits to him because he wasn't classified as needing them by the school district. It sounds like he began to leave the education system in a very slow way, was having problems, and developed fascination with guns, things like that. Those are indicators potentially of someone who may be prone to violence. It's one of those things where you know it when you see it, but because we don't train people how to identify it, sometimes threat assessment works and sometimes it doesn't. It's not an exact science. So the way you guys deal with a lot of things, you see ADA access, things like that. What I see on my side of the house, and I'm trained in NTAC, that's National Threat Assessment Center for mental health, identifying people with mental health issues that may become violent. Those type of people require professional assessment by people who are psychologists, people who are involved, potentially parents, teachers, law enforcement, security, people that run into them in the education system. And even that isn't particularly 100% foolproof in identifying those people because there is no exact profile. So a lot of times you may not even know you stopped somebody in the path to violence by doing a good behavioral threat assessment on them. But a lot of times it becomes an issue where they don't even be able to identify people. You guys remember the Arapahoe shooting a few years ago?
Yeah.
At STEM school. So that individual, it had 2 threat assessments, one done by the school and one his mother actually had done by a professional psychologist. And both of them actually identified him as a low threat. And here he becomes an active shooter. There's no 100% cure-all for some of the threats we see in the education system. It won't make sense.
Yeah. Well, it's actually frightening to think about what you're saying, and that there's all these mental health professionals and experts and law enforcement professionals and other safety professionals who study this for a living. And you say there's no specific profile. And it begs the question, Susan and I regularly handle student misconduct cases that might involve a student getting in trouble for posting a picture with a toy gun or fake bullets, things like that. And we've seen, believe it or not, we've seen students expelled for these types of social media posts. So can you talk to us a little bit about what's the difference between maybe a real warning sign versus something along the lines of a student making a joke that, of course, is not funny?
No, and I just want to add, because every year it seems like, Kristina, wouldn't you agree, they always happen in September. The jokes come online.
Often.
Yeah,
that's a good point.
and we're seeing middle school kids, because they have access to devices younger and younger. And I don't want to profile, but typically it's boys who will post pictures, and they really do think it's a joke or that it's just for friends. They don't expect it to get out. So how is a school supposed to know the difference between this is just a normal kid, and if you expel this kid, you're really derailing their education or causing a school to prison pipeline versus we got to watch this kid?
Right. It's really the entirety of behavior of the student who actually has the incident, right? A kid drawing a picture of a gun could go either way, right? Does he have an unhealthy obsession with the gun? Does he have access to firearms? Has he done things in the past that would lead people to believe that he's violent, that has tendencies potentially? Is the individual suicidal? Does he bully other children? All those things come together. Drawing the picture of the firearm itself, in and of itself, may be absolutely nothing. And that's one of the problems we have. Since Columbine, there was this big, huge zero tolerance for violence policy.
Sure.
Yeah, and that doesn't work, really doesn't. That's why professional behavioral threat assessment is so important. There's a couple different programs out there. In my role as a school professional, one of the things that I do is company does risk assessments, and I go and conduct risk assessment. In fact, I'm in the process of actually writing a risk assessment for a school district that had an active shooter last year that we were at. And one of the things we're looking at.
Clarify, Joe, when you say a risk assessment, I just want to understand, for the institution, or do you do it on a specific student? I just want to make sure.
We're doing it on the institution.
Thank you.
The
I
entire
just didn't understand that. Okay.
facility. So we're looking at all their safety and security procedures and their personnel and their training. And there's a lot of interviews. We look at the physical security and safety, and all those things come together, because that requires safety and security requires a very comprehensive plan. And it's not just the physical side of things. It's the mental health side of things. Are you providing behavioral threat assessment? Are you providing training to people? Are you training emergency operation plan, continuity of operation plans? All those things go into a risk assessment. But one of the things we see is when we start going to do a risk assessment in district and we ask for paperwork, they'll tell us that they have a threat assessment team, right? They maybe have a school psychologist or social worker on the team. They have maybe a school resource officer, principal, teacher, sometimes outside professionals, depending on the case. What we find is they're meeting, but they really don't have a good sense of guidelines on how to conduct the assessment. They don't have good record keeping. They're not using the National Threat Assessment Center from the Secret Service has professional standards in order how to conduct a risk assessment for someone who potentially could be violent, or potentially it's a student acting out, or like you said, it could be a student who just did something that thought it'd be funny among his friends and it blew up in their face. So what's the decision has to be, what is the difference between all three of those individuals? Having a policy that says if anyone does anything, we kick them out of school doesn't benefit anyone, especially the student that is the subject of the behavioral threat assessment.
Let me ask you, is there any way, there's a lot that goes into this. This is a complicated issue, of course. Is there any way for schools to identify early on before the catastrophe happens when a potential shooter, a student who might engage in some sort of violence enters the building?
Or a stranger.
Sure.
Doesn't have to be a student. It could be just some unidentified citizen.
A lot of people don't understand, specifically active shooter events in education. Over 90% of them are internal threats. They're students, staff members.
Wow, that's really interesting. So it's not strangers.
Intimately associated with the school.
Wow. Okay.
When you say associated, could you tell us who's in that 90%?
So you're talking students. There's been staff members, obviously. There have been husbands of teachers, parents. They're all people that are intimately associated with the school, that know facility, that know where people are, all of that stuff. But I'm not going to get into lockdown right now because we're on a different topic. But when you realize—
We're going to get there, Joe. Hang tight. Okay.
When we get to 90, when you think about 90% of the people are either from the facility or intimately acquainted with it, these are people a lot of times that are known. Now, sometimes it's former students that commit crimes, but a lot of times, if we can identify behavioral issues in students that are young without labeling them as a threat, maybe they just have behavioral issues that they need to work on, kind of stuff. Those kind of things are early interventions with students that you can maybe potentially change behaviors in young students so that they don't become disillusioned, that they don't become bullies or victim of bullying, things like that. Those are all things that kind of need identified early in the process. A lot of times I'll see and hear from teachers and staff on risk assessments that they have anti-bullying training maybe at the junior high level and the high school level, but they're not doing it at elementary school where it actually really is beginning.
Well, when you talk about early intervention, you're speaking our language because we're all about advocating for early intervention. But I want to shift a little bit.
Sure.
Because this podcast, we're both parents. You're a parent, Joe. You're talking to parents. So if you were going to speak to parents, which you're doing now, what should parents be telling their children about, God forbid, if something happens, how to respond? Because I know I would say, and it's probably the wrong thing you're going to tell me, but my instinct is that fight, flight. But really, in this case, it's flight, like run away, go.
But I'm not sure that I don't think when I hear my daughter talk about the training she does at her school, it's the opposite. So I'm curious, Joe, you're the expert. What should parents be talking to their kids about realistically?
So what a lot of people don't understand is, we talk about it in a very ubiquitous way, the word lockdown, right? Kind of covers everything. Everybody uses it for everything. Lockdown's a code word, number one, which we shouldn't even be thinking about using. FEMA came out in 2006 that don't use codes. Tell people exactly what's happening so they know how to respond. And I keep hearing the word lockdown.
It scares me. I feel trapped. It's
you're actually trapping. You're doing the one thing that someone who becomes an active shooter or is a suspect in one of these things. Lockdown actually does the one thing that the gunman is completely unable to do by themselves. That is gain control of an entire facility that is populated by almost every room by people and gives them complete and utter control of the facility. And absolutely almost in no way is there anything that's going to happen other than potentially you put a door lock between the suspect and a room full of kids. But that door lock, the windows and the doors, none of those are manufactured to withstand gunfire. There's just the infrastructure doesn't match the response.
If someone wants to get in the room, they're going to get in the room.
Yeah,
right?
no, like I said, my instinct has always just not like the idea of telling your kid to stay in the room. So what do you do, Joe?
Yeah, here's the thing. And really, we have examples of this already nationally in training in fire response. I mean, fire response, all of us know how to respond to a fire. We've been trained nationally to how to respond to a fire since 1960. And that 62 years of training has told us that if the building's on fire and you're under danger, you should leave. But it also gives us other options. Like if we're in contact with a fire, you catch on fire, you're supposed to stop, drop, and roll. We train people, if other people on fire and they panic and they start to run, knock them down, roll on top of them, extinguish flames with your own body. We're trained fire extinguishers, the infrastructure, the buildings built around us surviving a fire and everything. But the interesting thing is, and this is originally why we got on this call, is we don't train people to fight fires, right? We don't do that. But we train them how to do everything else. Active shooter is the exact same thing, but because lockdown tactics and active shooter come from Southern California from the 1970s, but the problem is rooted in the 1960s. The riots in Watts in Los Angeles caused the Los Angeles Unified School District to fence in several of their properties around their schools to keep threats outside, right? A very common concept called concentric rings of security to prevent threats from coming from the neighborhoods onto the school grounds. That concept worked very well for particular types of threats. However,
at that moment in time, too.
At that moment in time.
And that moment in time, because
that infrastructure works very well, right, for certain threats. But however, in the 1970s, when the FBI defeats the mafia in Southern California, basically, right, it creates power backing. The power backing is still by gangs. Those gangs begin to target each other, where the mafia really targeted people in a particular way, right? They found a target, person was the target. The gangs began to just spray gunfire in the streets, and drive-by shootings became like a major event in these cities, and still to some extent they are. But really in the 70s and 80s, this was a huge problem in the 1990s. But what happened was the kids who were at the school when they were shot at on the street had the ability to run away. But the fencing for the threats that was installed in the 60s became a trap for the students that were on school grounds. You know anything about Los Angeles, the school grounds, it's warm all day, right? So the kids are outside, their cafeterias are outside, their lunchrooms are outside, their gyms are outside. They have courtyard open schools with doors that open to the courtyards. There's no interior hallways. So when these events happened, the ability to run away was fixed by the fence, and they could not leave the area. So Los Angeles had to come up with a different response. And they actually began to call what's called drive-by shooting drills. You can actually look these up. The first reference I can find to them in a national publication is an Ed Week in January of 1993, where a reporter does a study on how drive-by shooting drills are being used for shootings that are beginning to happen on school campuses. So this is 30 years ago.
Apply that today. Are we supposed to train our students in an orderly way how to get out of the building?
For fire, yes. But here's the problem. When we see training, right? Organization's good in training, and you need to crawl, walk, run when you do training, right? But we don't pick the time, the place, or the victims of an event. And if you have a one-size-fits-all plan like lockdown, single option response, and you have to be in a room and you have to do certain steps in order to remain safe, those plans are not flexible. They're not like a fire plan that has flexibility based on your location to the fire. If I told you to go into a room and close the door and wait for the fire department to come save you during a fire, you would tell me I was insane. But that's
but let me ask you this, though.
What's up?
If one teacher, it sounds like, so I hear you, we can't have one size fits all, because you don't know exactly what threat is going to present itself. But isn't it also true you can't have some teachers evacuating students and other teachers in the same school keeping students locked in? Because isn't that a total recipe for chaos?
Actually, chaos works in our favor during these events. These are human beings committing these crimes. Human beings can only focus on one thing at a time. And if you give them control of an entire facility in which every room in that facility, people say you're hiding and they turn off the lights and all that stuff. That is the most ridiculous thing I have ever heard, because the threat is 90% of them come from the facility or are intimately acquainted with it. And, at 1:23 in the afternoon on a Tuesday at a school, how many rooms are occupied?
So, Joe, I'm going to press you because our listeners need something to take home. What would you tell your child to do, depending on the age? Could you break it up between
Sure.
elementary, middle, and a high school student?
Young elementary school students should listen to the teachers, but that requires the teachers to be properly trained based on
Sure.
the location of the event, right? So my kids, regardless of where they're at in school right now, in elementary school, only about 60 to 70% of the school day spent in a classroom. So you could potentially lock down in a classroom, right? That may be an option based on your location, based on where the threat is. However, they're also on the playground, in the cafeteria, in the bathroom, in the hallways, in the library, in the gym. All of those locations may require a different response. That may require evacuation. So it doesn't mean everyone in the building does the same thing. Every response is based on your location, based on where the threat is. And you have to have some type of ability to adjust to a threat if you are in contact with it. I'm sure everyone
What
read
do
about
you
the
tell?
teacher.
I
What's that?
got to push you on this, and I normally don't push my guests hard.
Oh, no, go ahead.
But what should the parent tell
The high school kids.
the high school kids?
High school kids, I told my high school kids, the first thing you do, regardless of what's happening, if you know there's a threat and you're able to evacuate the facility, the policy
Go.
means nothing. Leave the facility.
There you go.
That's what
Susan's instincts were correct.
leaves-
what
it-
I've always told my kids.
It
Get
leave
out.
leave the facility. Number two, if you don't know where the threat is or you're in close contact with it and you have the ability and you don't have the ability to leave the facility, that's when you use lockdown. But it's not traditional lockdown where I'm only relying on a door. I'm barricading a door. There's a lot of doors in schools where students cannot lock them because they don't have keys.
Right.
Teachers may not be present. All those things affect the response. That's why you need the ability to be flexible. So students need to know how to barricade a location. They need to know how to prepare countermeasures inside if the location is breached. All of these things. The people killing them normally are their classmates. So they know these people and they know who they are. The ability to barricade a location is good. And I've told my children, if you are in contact, once they probably hit junior high, I told them, if you're in contact and you cannot evacuate and there's no ability to barricade, because like I said, bad guy picked the time, the place, and the victims. You do whatever you need to do to survive that event. It could be swarming the gunman. It could be throwing things to the gunman's face to crack them. It could be trying to run past the gunman. We're all different as human beings. Training, there's a scientific study that I have published with two professors in the Journal of School Violence, where we actually studied response with lockdown and multi-option response with active shooter. Individuals that use multi-option response, it doesn't mean everyone survives. It doesn't mean no one's injured. What it does mean is the casualties decrease in that circumstance by over 75% when you use multi-option response over lockdown when there's an actual threat. So it becomes important to tell the kids everything that they can do to survive, not just one single thing, because if the one single thing fails, then pretty much everyone that's at that location ends up being shot.
Thank you.
It's such a complicated issue. I'd like to take a few moments to turn our attention to the report that's recently come out examining the Uvalde shooting. We know that the report indicates it was total chaos and a multitude of systemic failures, what transpired that day. How do we prevent the chaos when people realize a shooter might be in the building and it's terrifying? And can you tell us what are some of the key takeaways from that report? And what do you think we should all know and learn from that report?
I guess we'll start with the school response. It's pretty obvious that the school, and it's interesting because the state of Texas certified that school as being prepared for an active shooter.
Oh my gosh.
So that was one of the big, huge takeaways from the report.
Terrifying.
The state said they were okay, which means obviously what they had in place, it's not just the law enforcement failure. It was the failure of their training. It was the failure of their planning. It was the failure of whatever they had told their students to do when something happened. The teacher in the one classroom where all the students were killed and the teacher survived, which I don't know how I feel about myself. The teacher said that their plan failed And when the gunman came in the room, they were all sitting on the floor where they had been told to hide. And the gunman just walked down and shot all of them. And it's not the first time that's in the use of lockdown. So the school did not have whatever the state said they had in place, obviously didn't work. There were, sounds like broken door locks or doors that were propped, things like those are huge safety concerns at any time, especially with a school that was having a ton of lockdowns because of border patrol activity in the area, things like that, where they were leaving doors open, apparently, which anyone could have come into the school. They had fencing around the school. It was only 5 feet high. That is not a proper height. It doesn't sound like they had professional risk assessment, which is the basis of everything you do. And you never, ever, you guys know this, never, ever assess yourself and your capabilities. You always
No, because of course we're biased.
No. And Joe, I don't know if you agree with this, but I think that in preparing for today and just everyday reading the news, the response from both healthcare workers getting kids out of there, getting them medical attention, having law enforcement go in and know how to manage it, having school safety officers know how to manage it. There was a lot to take away from this situation.
So as a former law enforcement officer and a master trainer for state in solo engagement, and I was a former SWAT member, there were 376 police officers there and no one took charge. No one. No one ran operations inside, it sounds like. No one ran operations outside. It was mass chaos. I was kind of hoping the report would maybe talk about whatever the fire and emergency medical service response was. Were they organized? Were they prepared? Because usually there's a thing called unified command. And unified command is the law enforcement and fire response. I mean, you guys didn't mention this in my bio, but I sit on NFPA 3000, which writes the national standards for law enforcement, fire, and EMS to respond. Those things that are in the code in NFPA 3000, I don't believe were followed at all from what I've read and know so far. To me as a law enforcement officer, it's very disheartening to see what happened and to know that and it came out in the report that one of the agencies that supposedly talked about the law enforcement response didn't even conduct their own investigation. They took state reports and were trying to tell what went wrong during the incident. Obviously, from a legal standpoint, we all know that is completely the wrong way to do that. And it'll be very interesting when the interviews start happening with the officers, especially the command level officers that were there. And it's now come out with a report that the majority of officers at the scene were actually federal and state level law enforcement officers, not local law enforcement. So
Joe,
that tells me the training they had failed at all levels.
I agree that is an example and it's tragic. But can you give us a positive example of where something has gone right? Because we only hear.
Are there any positive?
There's stories where there was a potential active shooter, a school saw it, responded, and that is the model that we should be promoting. And I always try to give a takeaway to parents and end on some positive notes, because all we're hearing is what went wrong.
I'm trying to think of a good one that probably everyone would know. And I'll go with Ohio. Chardon's response was actually pretty good 10 years ago to their event.
Yes. The TJ Lane shooting. That's right.
Yeah.
Okay.
I never say the gunman's names, but yeah, that shooting.
He's in the media, so we can say
it. That incident, while not perfect, actually went fairly well because you guys all remember Frank Hall, right?
The football coach hero.
The football coach. The students initially, some of the classrooms and stuff barricaded, things like that. So that response was pretty good. Students were hiding under cafeteria tables, which was a lesson learned. It's like, get out of the cafeteria. We had a student in the cafeteria whose mother was trained by one of my instructors at Kent State at the time. And she had told her child to evacuate. And when that incident happened, the gunman was shooting children underneath a cafeteria table, and she was at the table next to it. She actually grabbed her friend and some kid she didn't even know at the time and drugged them out of the cafeteria and left. So there were some good lessons learned there. Frank Hall charging at the gunman distracted him from shooting students. Frank actually chases them out of the building, and definitely Frank's actions, while there were still students that were wounded and killed, his response stopped that incident from being way worse than it could. One of the things we learned from that incident in Chardon nationally was how important the reunification process is. because the reunification process worked very well when they evacuated the building with the students. That's important things to work on for events. Could be applied to other incidences in crimes or incidents in a school, but those were good takeaways. Not trying to hide in direct contact with a gunman obviously was a lesson learned, but other rooms in the facility, students evacuating, students barricading locations, those were all good actions taken actually on the scene by the students themselves, because obviously it was before school started. Some of the students weren't even being really supervised or even had the ability to take direction from teachers when an incident occurred. So it also showed.
That's a good point, because to what you said earlier about the older kids, essentially older students, I should say, use their judgment and respond to what's going on immediately around them. That incident unfolded in the early hours of the school day before school even had officially started, I think, and correct me if I'm wrong.
Kids were in the cafeteria, some were waiting for buses, and some were.
So those students, they
Instinctively
used their instincts and were able to respond better.
Look, I think from a career working with students, it is important for parents to tell students, and it's the first question we ask. Schools are safe. This is happening, but school, you need to have we all have to live our lives. We can't walk around being fearful every day, or the other mental health issues are going to skyrocket, and then you'll have other problems. We don't want more anxiety. We don't want more depression. But we have to be ready. And Joe, I just want to thank you, because we need people like you to come into the schools. We need to learn from the errors that have occurred and move forward somehow. So I appreciate the conversation today.
Yeah, I thought it was very good.
Thanks for joining us. It was really time well spent to hear from you as an expert. And there's so much more to learn and consider on this topic. Thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate it.
Bye, Joe.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Thanks for listening to Real Talk with Susan and Kristina. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to our show so you never miss an episode. And leave us a review so other people can find the content we share here. You can follow us on Instagram. Just search our handle @StoneSupler. And for more resources, visit us online at studentdefense.kjk.com. Thank you so much for being a part of our Real Talk community. We'll see you next time.